once somebody has had an experience of place, whether it's a forest or an ocean or a meadow, whatever it is, you need that embodied experience to want to fight to protect something. When you are like in a place and hearing the sounds and smelling the smells and just being in like a drinking from a crisp, cool spring, unfiltered, these are experiences that change you and make you want to protect them.
Welcome, wild ones. I'm your host, Josh Schlossberg of the Green Root Podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis. For this episode, our guest is Jillian Bar-Av. Jillian is a longtime Heartwood member, former council member, and former editor of Heartbeat, Heartwood's biannual newspaper. Her most recent involvement with the organization is to start up the Heartwood Forest Protection Podcast. Jillian is also a clinical herbalist by profession and credits the time she spent in the Ozarks doing forest protection work as the spark for her passion to become an herbalist. Jillian, welcome to the Green Root Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Josh.
Cool. So we have had a couple folks from Heartwood on in the past, but maybe a refresher to our audience. So what is Heartwood?
Thanks. Yeah. Heartwood is a nonprofit organization that was founded in 1991 to preserve and protect the forests, mainly around the central hardwood region. But, even from its inception, it's been more than just an organization. Its goal was to be a network organization, to connect activists living in different areas, but working on similar issues together so that they could bond with each other, help each other, support each other, and be more effective in their work by working together.
Yeah, that's so cool and so necessary. And Heartwood has been really central to the forest protection world, as far as I'm concerned, since I've been doing this work. And so Heartwood's focus is primarily on Eastern forests, but you do have connection to folks in the West and the issues, ecology, landscapes in the West as well, right?
Absolutely.
Well, because at a recent gathering of yours, so Chad Hansen, the forest ecologist, he gave a talk on, he does a lot on forest fire ecology in the West, but he also tied things into from West to East, is my understanding. That.
Yeah, I wasn't able to attend that gathering, so I can't really speak to it directly, but there's always been a broader goal of Heartwood, that it's not just about a particular forest or the particular place, it's about all forests everywhere.
Right. But yeah, having lived in the East as well as the West, and now I'm in Colorado, which is basically the West, but sort of almost Midwest. Yeah, I do see the importance of both people really having a deep connection to their local landscape, but also realizing that this is a national concern and that we all have to tie together in terms of public lands. But I do think, yeah, for sure, there are different ecological considerations. There's different logging industry propaganda that is being used. But I did want to ask you about this. So out here in the West, we are experiencing an onslaught of what I call wildfire pretense logging. And our listeners know this is the topic I'm obsessed with, and it's the main focus of Eco Integrity Alliance right now because it's the biggest Trojan horse we've ever seen. And we've been proven not to be alarmist, but to be accurate with what Trump is doing, unprecedented rescinding of the roadless rule, expansion of timber production, 112 million acres under fake emergency, all in the name of wildfire. So for those listeners who be like, why does Josh keep talking about wildfire? That's why. But
Well,
you've seen, yeah. Well, anyway, I was just going to ask you, you've seen the arguments in the West. Well, we have to log because of wildfire. You're seeing a lot of those even in the East, which have almost no semblance in reality, right?
that's exactly what I was going to respond to. And this is what Andy talks in depth about in the most recent podcast episode. about Buffalo Springs, which I know you interviewed him about the Buffalo Springs project as well. But the third episode of the Heartwood podcast is now about that. And that is the whole pretense that is driving the Buffalo Springs project, is just all this money that the Forest Service has in the name of fire. And so anything that they can say is, well, we're doing this because of it will reduce the risk of fire, even in an eastern damp hardwood forest that isn't likely to burn on its own. I mean, in fact, what they're doing is burning it and using it as a pretense for it will then prevent fires.
Yeah, yeah. So I just wanted to get that out of the way there to know that a lot of folks in the East might think that they're safe from the wildfire pretense logging, but they're not. And it's something we all have to address. And you mentioned Andy. So, of course, that's Andy Mahler, longtime legendary forest protection advocate who sadly recently passed away. And yes, we did have a recent episode that we were really happy to have been able to salvage because we had interviewed him in the spring and his internet, I guess he was in his backyard, wasn't particularly very good that day. And we thought we had to scrap the whole episode. We were trying to reschedule. We were never able to do that. But I went back to the recording, and while some of the video was a little choppy, the audio was almost perfect. So I was really happy with that. And I sat there and I listened to the whole thing. But so the Heartwood Forest Protection Podcast. So tell us what that is and why you started that.
Well, it does go back to Andy Mahler because I wanted to interview him about some parts of his life, um, really because we knew he was sick with stage 4 cancer and that his time with us was limited. And so I made a visit out to him in the spring of 2024. I wanted to be with him while he was still in relatively good health. And from there, I asked him, Andy, who's getting down your life? Who is making recordings with you about your life, or who is writing the book of your life? Because what you have done here is important for people to know about. And, he said that there were several different people doing different various projects, but that it was probably going to be something that took several or many people to get down, which planted the seed. And then later on that summer, I reached out to him and I said, listen, would you be willing to sit down with me and do some recordings about your life? I want to talk to you. And he said, yes, absolutely. And from there, I didn't want it to just be about like me talking to Andy and like somehow publish a few episodes just about his life and that's it. So I got back involved with Heartwood. And although I've been a longtime member of Heartwood, I really had not been involved for many years. And so what got me back involved was actually the death of Robert Hoyt in 2023. And the loss of Robert hit me very hard. And I hadn't been in touch with Robert for over 10 years. And I found myself going back to the Lazy Black Bear, Andy and Linda's home in Southern Indiana, to the memorial for Robert, and felt the spark of reconnection with Heartwood folks. So when I found out that Andy was sick, I was like, I don't want that same thing to happen where I'm just out of touch with somebody and then they're gone. So anyway, we had this idea to do some recordings of him, and I brought it to the Heartwood Council and asked them, could we make it a Heartwood thing? And it was like a time or an idea whose time had come. Everybody was totally on board. Yes, please help us. Let's do that. And so it's more than just these interviews with Andy, but that was the inspiration and the start. And I was able to sit down with him on 4 different occasions. And so the first 4 episodes are these somewhat lengthy conversations with Andy about different aspects of his life, ranging from his childhood to the founding of Heartwood, the Buffalo Springs project, and then the final episode about him will come out, and that's really about cancer and the transformation at the end of his life. So, and then I've also interviewed a whole bunch of other Heartwood folks, and those will be published as well for season 1.
Great. Yeah, that's so excellent. I'm looking forward to all of that. Since we know a little bit about Andy Mahler, maybe you can tell us a little bit about Robert Hoyt.
Oh, sure. Well, Robert Hoyt was a fantastic eco musician. And like Andy, they were both connectors. They connected, I mean, I would say hundreds and hundreds, it's probably in the thousands of people together, and brought the message of hope and inspiration for protecting our natural world. And so Robert toured the country coast to coast over and over. I was a student when he came and played on, my college campus, and he did that all over the country, and was just such an inspiration to everybody, and such a loving person.
Yeah, I appreciate his work. I'm a musician myself. I write some eco songs, sort of eco horror songs. It's weird stuff, but I appreciate his combining of arts and advocacy. And I think that that's so crucial and something that we often ignore. We're trying to utilize science, which I think is really important, but I think that most people are not necessarily convinced by science. It's almost like emotion and experience. So, experience of the forest. And then, if you can tell stories around the importance of this and why we should take action, I think that's the beauty of arts. What do you think about that connection between arts and advocacy? Is that something that we should do more of?
I mean, I think it's both essential, and it like kind of is a natural outgrowth of being in touch with yourself and something you care about, and that the human condition wants to express itself in some sort of artistic way, whether that's, painting, music, writing. Yeah.
So, what makes you care so much about forests? There's a lot of folks out there who have lots of different issues they're concerned about. Most people, because we're human, gravitate towards social issues. I think that's pretty clear. There is a fair amount of attention towards climate, which of course forest is a part of, but this idea of having a focus on forests and maybe even particularly public lands forests, like, why does that draw you in personally?
Well, I guess it would go back to, gosh, that's such a big question, because it could go back to childhood, it could go back to like other experiences in the wild. But what really got me directed in it was around student activism that I was doing, which led me to be a participant and organizer in something called Ozark Summer '94, which was a pivotal summer. That's also where I got introduced to Heartwood at my first Heartwood Forest Council. And me and this kind of ragtag group of young people spent the summer in the Ozarks, traveling around, trying to raise awareness and do direct action around logging and mining on public lands in the Ozarks of southern Missouri and northern Arkansas. And so during that time, while it was under the guise of, changing what was happening there, the real impact was how it changed us living in the forest for, an extended period of time, 2 or 3 months, just camping and being a part of our environment in that way. So, yeah, well, I think that in general, once somebody has had an experience of place, whether it's a forest or an ocean or a meadow, whatever it is, you need that embodied experience to want to fight to protect something. And I think that that is, with the climate change movement, so important. I mean, we've been yelling about global warming since the 90s, but it's abstract. Talking about like reducing carbon is very theoretical. Whereas when you are like in a place and hearing the sounds and smelling the smells and just being in like a drinking from a crisp, cool spring, unfiltered, these are experiences that change you and make you want to protect them.
Yeah, I think that's a great summation. And while I would agree that the climate crisis is of great concern, it is a harder thing to put your finger on and it's harder to prove. But that's the thing about a forest. Look at this standing forest over here. Look at these stumps and chewed up logging roads over here. It's a pretty evident thing. You can't deny the existence of it. An organization I used to work for years ago Native Forest Council had the slogan, "Stumps don't lie." It was a bumper sticker. And
I
it's
remember
like,
that.
yeah. Now, of course, we do have the agencies in the industry claiming, well, it's good when we create stumps, but that's a little bit harder for them to explain away, although wildfire is their Trojan horse. But at least they can't say this hasn't happened the way that people will deny CO2 because it's invisible. Even things like toxic air pollution, toxic water pollution, ground pollution, those are all extremely important issues. They can be harder to prove 100%, but a tree versus a stump, you know, unless it's AI, it's going to be real.
Oh my gosh, don't get me started on AI.
Whole other topic there, but yeah, so I really like how Heartwood does have that focus on alliance and network building. And I think that has been really successful. And I think it's something that I'm more interested in. And what we're trying to do with Eco Integrity Alliance is to draw those connections between people who are working on different pieces of the puzzle. And the way I see it is we do have to focus on our local area. There's just no way around that. That's not a NIMBYism. It's that's the most logical piece. But the tricky part is tying that into regional and then national efforts. And I think that's a lot of what Heartwood's done. That's what we're trying to do at Eco Integrity Alliance. But talking about a local area. So I've never been to the Ozarks. I don't know how many of our listeners have been either. Maybe you could just describe the landscape a little bit. It doesn't have to be exact tree species, just like what's the feel of the Ozarks?
Well, that is where I got my inspiration and my start, but I do want to say I don't live there anymore and
Yeah,
I'm not from there. So I have been living in Maryland for the past 20 years. I do, Missouri and Arkansas will always hold like a special place in my heart. And the main feature there are the rivers and the mountains are, correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but like unglaciated. So when you look out there, on a, when you look at Rockies or at the Appalachian Mountains, the peaks go like up and down. And when you look out on the mountains of the Ozarks, it's like flat. So there was like a big glacier, like a lake, and then it melted and it left like this flat top to all the mountains. Um, they're gentle mountains and old mountains, and the springs are one of the dominant features. These huge, not always huge, but some are very large freshwater springs.
cool. Yeah, I'd like to get down there at some point. It's just a part of the country I've never been. And then in Maryland, so what's it like there? I'm from the Northeast. I'm familiar with a fair amount of the area, maybe down to Pennsylvania and New Jersey, but I can't say I've ever walked in a Maryland forest.
Well, so one difference with Maryland is there's no national forest. And so you asked about like why the interest in public lands. And I do want to touch back on that because, the public lands means that they are ours. They should be publicly owned and managed. But the way that they're being managed is like for resource extraction. And so the recreational aspect of going to our national forest is not high on the list of the agency that is, we would think, protecting those forests, the National Forest Service. So in Maryland, there's no national forest. There are state forests and state parks. And so I live outside of Baltimore and I frequent the state parks around here, and I'm drawn to water. So I'm always going wherever there's a river, but they're not like spring-fed rivers the way they are in the Ozarks. They're not like that clear water. They're beautiful in their own way, but the Ozarks are very special.
Yeah, I have a soft space in my heart for the eastern forests, even ones that don't have national forests. And I think that they're an example of what the West should be aware of is like too much development, too much fragmentation, and we start not having much of a natural world left. Now, luckily, the deciduous forests out there, they do grow quite profusely and things start filling in. And state parks, state forests, I mean, that's public lands. And the vision that many of us have at Eco Integrity Alliance is that all public lands should be set aside as climate, biodiversity, watershed preserves, whether that's a municipal park up to a national park. So I'm curious, what do you think about that idea, whether it looks exactly like that or not, but taking this broad view of public lands as some sort of preserves, because clearly right now, whatever the multiple use is not working
Oh,
too
yeah.
well.
No, I'm all for that. I mean, and that is the vision. And Andy talks about that vision for the Hoosier National Forest to be, that is what people are working on the ground in the Shawnee to create these forests that are currently under the Department of Agriculture, which is why they're being managed for their timber, and get them out of there. People have been pushing for this for a long time, but I do think it's a time, like an idea whose time is very ripe to create them into national parks.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential options that we can do with the land. And I know a bunch of different folks are bringing up those ideas. So in that neck of the woods, for sure, there are folks that, with the wild yak up in Montana who want to create climate reserves across basically the northern forests and some of the boreal forests. There's us at Eco Integrity Alliance. We're talking about these climate biodiversity watershed reserve, whatever that is, that bigger picture, and then having that discussion about maybe, well, almost certainly the Department of Agriculture is not the place for wild ecosystems. It's
Right.
an inherent conflict of interest. I still don't think everyone understands what the Forest Service is or has become, unfortunately. I think because it has the word forest in its name, it sounds good and it has service. So I do think an escalation is required. So what's your take on this debate right now? So the Trump administration is doing some unprecedented stuff in terms of public lands assault. Weirdly, he's also taking funding away. So it may, it's like foot on the brake, foot on the gas. It may actually end up stalling out, ironically. But his at least stated intention seems to be about really expanding logging like we've never seen, and up to, like we've said before, rescinding the roadless rule and everything like that. A lot of folks are saying, okay, well, this is the time right now where we're getting hit pretty hard. We got to kind of like step back. We got to just focus on the few things that we can do. And we've got to just basically circle the wagons, hope for the best, not stick our necks out too much. So there's that one philosophy that tends to be perpetuated by some of the larger environmental groups, which I will be the first to say do things that I agree with and also do things I don't agree with. But some others of us are saying that this is the best time to actually finally say what it is we really want. That instead of constantly, endlessly fighting one little battle after another, playing defense, definitely necessary, right? We got to have goalies on the soccer field. But now is the time to, even if we can't make the policy, to build these movements around, okay, we tried the reasonable approach. We tried the defensive approach. Can't we acknowledge this has not worked? And can we not have a bigger idea that can excite people rather than saying, yeah, we oppose the rescinding of the roadless rule? Of course we do. Of course we have to say that. Of course that's a piece of it. But we actually are saying we need to have a public lands protection movement that, whether it's climate reserves, whether it's local versions of it, national, anyway, whatever the bigger picture idea, a positive campaign for people to latch onto, to get excited about. Where do you fall on that after me asking that leading question?
Well, I definitely fall on the positive side. I mean, there's nothing like a positive vision to get people excited. And it's always been that with Heartwood. From the earliest meetings, there were always maps out on the table. and talking about the bioregions and what needed to happen so that we could allow for wildlife to get from one place to another, and what this like long-term vision would look like if bioregions were connected by corridors. So, wildlands, and so absolutely, I'm going to be going to the upcoming Heartwood reunion, and I'm sure that there will be a lot of talk and strategizing about that kind of thing. But I think what you're talking about sounds fantastic.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that because I think we have an unprecedented opportunity. The public lands issue is more in people's minds than before. I think oddly, the Trump's overreach is helping us in a weird way because for those of us, particularly who've been pointing out wildfire pretense logging as this Trojan horse, and a lot of people have been poo-pooing that even in the conservation community. I don't think they can do that anymore. I don't think they can pretend that because in the press release to announce the decision to rescind the roadless rule from the USDA, US Department of Agriculture, they mentioned fire, I believe it was 5 times in a few paragraphs. So that's the thing that they're hanging their hat on, particularly in the West, also in the East. So it seems like beating this dead horse, but my take is that they can't get away with just straight up forest destruction for timber production or other greed purposes anymore. It's a lot tougher. Let's just put it that way.
Well, yeah, and the problem is that it's not going to be housed, like you said, they're not going to say we are doing this to cut down trees for timber sale. They're going to say this is for ecological restoration. And so they confuse what it is they're doing and make it so the public doesn't understand what's actually happening because they're using words that don't actually reflect what they actually are doing. And Andy calls it language abuse, and I think that's a great way to put it.
It is. As a word guy myself, I mean, I'm a better writer than I am a speaker, but I am very concerned about the manipulation of language by entities like the Forest Service. And I think what's so funny is many of us are so intent on using scientific terms for everything, which I think is fine. Being accurate, of course, we should be accurate, but we're almost like, well, we don't want to seem too euphemistic and overdoing. Meanwhile, our other side is just using all of this fictitious language, trashing dictionary definitions. Out here in Colorado, I can't tell you how many times people have called me a liar for calling the cutting of trees down as logging. There's like, it's not logging. I'm like, I'm not even using that as an inflammatory term. It's just like the most obvious word that means things. Like it's the cutting of trees for sale. Like that's what's happening. And they're like, well, in this case, the wood is less smirch. I'm like, are you kidding me? I'm like, use whatever term you like, but don't tell me I can't use the dictionary definition of words. But yeah, I think Andy is right on with that. And that's why I think it's really important that we do create our own media, whatever that looks like. So folks may know I used to work as a investigative journalist. I did all sides of the story that I could find, and I portrayed them as accurately as I could and as balanced as I could, knowing my own bias. I would even try to correct for that. Uh, I see media these days as just advocacy. I've been really disappointed at the failure of media, either because they're unable to or unwilling to accurately cover environmental issues. So I'm wondering, what do you feel about the current media landscape around maybe not just forest public lands, but particularly environmental, ecological thing? Do you feel like media is doing a good job on that?
I don't think so, but it's hard for me to think about anything about media right in this moment without thinking about like what's actually happening today and yesterday with the canceling of Jimmy Kimmel's show, and like what's happening at a national level with our media being really taken over by the federal government. And I don't even know that, there's anything that we can count on in the national media right now. And it's very scary.
Yeah, I would agree, and I would be the first to critique the right side of things, the Republicans. But I have to say, here in Colorado, our media circles its wagons around the Democrats and all the logging that they're pushing. So it's weird that, like, out here, if we actually had more different media outlets, they'd be more likely to critique them. So stuff that's going on a national level is one thing, but out here, they just run cover for their chosen party. So I would personally argue that it's a bipartisan issue, even if I would be more likely to personally critique Republicans. But I do think it is fair to point out that some of the worst logging that's being proposed is the Trump administration, is Republicans, but it's also Democrats. And you don't have to comment on that. That's just my take on what I've been dealing with media out here. It hasn't been Republican led media. It's actually been folks who seem to either just have an ideology of whatever their party tells them, or they're have a view that there should be no criticism of it because the other side is worse. Or I think that's a fair argument, or that they're trying to maintain connection to elected officials. And if they do too much critiquing, all of a sudden they'll lose that. But
Mhm.
anyway, we don't have to go down that road. So I think engaging with media is really important. I've been a part of specific campaigns to do so over the years. I'm realizing more and more they are just completely obstinate, and kind of many of them, not all of them, because I have to acknowledge there are some that will do a good job, and some at least occasionally will do a good job, others regularly, but they seem to be intent on just running themselves into the ground and losing their credibility, while on top, yes, being censored by the other side. So there's this whole swirling mess. I'm no longer convinced that many media outlets are open to critique, leaving aside government meddling in things. Um, so my view is we have to create more of our own media, which may be a kind of advocacy media, because we have to kind of balance the scales there. If we don't have a balanced media out there, and all we're hearing is industry agency filtered through media, we're going to have to put out that other side of the story to balance it. So that's why I have the Green Root podcast. That's why I'm trying to do more with Substack. But would you see the Heartwood Forest Protection Podcast as a version of that new media?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I listen, I'm not actually a media person. I just am like wanting to help get stories out there that other people have to tell to move the needle in the direction that I would like to see it go, which is, preserving and protecting the forests, and, all the just basically saving the earth, we could say. So this is just my small contribution and part that I'm, putting out there now.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, what does it mean to be a media person? I would say at this point, if we're advocates, we're all kind of media people. We have to put out information. And now that we have social media and proliferation of other ways of getting out information, we are all media, is just presenting information to a wider audience. But I'm excited for the podcast that you're going to be doing. I think having more of those out there is really great. Another excellent podcast is Our Public Lands. So that's with Adam Bronstein. He does a great job with that. So I think more of these, the better, in kind of cross pollination and a way to look at it without getting too much into the weeds of podcast stuff, because I don't know how interested our listeners are in that. But if you're somebody who pays attention to comedy podcasts, that's what I like because I listen to all sorts of dark stuff. I'm into philosophy. I zero in on some of what I see as like the darkness of the universe. So I like to balance it with comedy, and they have all these comedy podcasts, and they really do a great job of cross pollinating. So they don't look at it as a competition. They're like, you come on mine, I'll come on yours, I'll advertise your, and that builds the whole network, the scene of comedy podcasting, and they've been very successful at that. So I think that's a
Mhm.
model we might want to consider. there's so many people that have this scarcity mentality of like, oh, there's only so many audiences and, we're doing something separate or whatever. It's like boosting everyone's signal, I think, is what we need to do.
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. And I am a huge fan of podcasts, which is why I think I gravitated to creating one. I've been listening to podcasts for years, and it's just like constantly what I am consuming. I personally don't have time for watching a lot of videos, but I can listen to things while I'm driving, while I'm doing the dishes, doing housework, a lot of things. And you're right. I am often led from one to the next because of that cross pollination that is happening within that world.
Yeah, I think it's good for us to look at other social ecosystems out there to see what they're doing right, what they're not. As a horror author, I've looked at a lot of how horror authors work, and really a lot of them are very just insular, and it's kind of like me against the world. And then they have like their little factions where they go, like that's strangely what happened to in the writing world and the publishing world. And I think that's part of why, sadly, the publishing world is sort of imploding. So I think learning lessons from how not to do things from places that seem different but have a similar you know connective tissue. So that's what I've been looking at. And I think, yeah, boosting one another's signals, getting more of this out there, I would say the more the better. The more that this becomes a thing, I think I'm not going to critique the climate movement here, but what I will say is that I feel like the climate movement has been in some ways the best thing that's ever happened in the environmental movement. And it's also been a very challenging thing because it sucks all the oxygen out of the room. It becomes the environmental movement. Now, obviously, we have to address climate issues, and they go hand in hand with forest issues. I'm just kind of bummed that the whole origins of the environmental movement, which basically came from land protection, it's really shifted away. And we even have a lot of folks in that world who are not just ignoring or poo-pooing, but like are advocating for a lot of land manipulation or whatever. So I think getting back to basics in terms of public lands organizing, having a big idea of a positive idea that we can rally people around. I think a lot of social movements have done that, and they're not worried about finding some middle of the road perspective. I think that ultimately might happen with elected officials, but the way I see our role as advocates is to advocate for the thing that we want. They're like, well, we'll never get that. Like, how is that my concern? My concern as an advocate is what is the thing that would work best for ecological integrity? And it's clearly to protect these areas under whatever reasoning. And the argument, and I'd be curious, like what would be your response to an argument of people saying, well, come on, that's so pie in the sky. You're not going to get your climate reserve. You're not going to switch the Department of Agriculture to the Department of Ecology. Just do little tiny things and shut up about it.
Hmm. No, I think that you have to go for the pie in the sky. And Heartwood is a great example of that because the Heartwood always took a zero logging on public lands stance before it was popular, and the larger environmental organizations did not for a long time until suddenly they did because it was being pushed by people from Heartwood and other organizations. But it's just like you can't get what you want if you don't go for it.
I think that's very wise. And I think that's very obvious and evident. And I'm not sure how the environmental movement has fallen away from that. But anyway, it's been great to have you. I do want to have one last segment. So this is a new segment that I'm incorporating into the Green Root podcast, which I should have incorporated, I don't know, 96 episodes ago when I started it. But the concept of the Green Root podcast is getting to the roots of the ecological crisis. And of course, all the topics that I bring guests on to talk about are about addressing root issues, but I haven't directly posed the question to people. So that's now what I'm doing for the final segment of the Green Root podcast is I will ask people, what do they feel is the root or just a root of many roots of the ecological crisis? What do you think?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I do think this is just a root of many roots, but what comes up for me is, and I already talked about this, but experiential connection to place. Without getting people out into their environment and having an actual experience of a place, it becomes a very theoretical thing to protect it. But once people have experienced it with all of their senses, they're much more likely to want to do something to keep it protected.
I think that makes perfect sense. That's where I've been going a lot in terms of getting people out to the woods in for hikes. We've led, I don't know, maybe a couple hundred people out over the last couple of years into the forest, just getting it back to the basics. We have to do things online. We have to do Zoom. We have to do all that stuff, but take people back to the land. That lack of connection with the land makes it like, why should I care? That's just a backdrop. That's a green screen for my activities. What do I care? So I think that's very wise, and I really appreciate that. So yeah, thanks again, Jillian, for coming on the Green Root podcast. We'll have some links in the description, and we'll run a little trailer for the podcast. But where can people find the work of Heartwood, the Heartwood Forest Protection Podcast, or anything that you may be doing?
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah, well, the heartwood.org website, very soon we'll have direct links to the podcast. But for now, you can, if you want to listen in audio, just search Heartwood Forest Protection Podcast in Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to watch it in video form, we have the Heartwood Podcast YouTube page. You'll find it there.
Excellent. Well, thanks again for coming on the podcast and for all your great work.
Thank you so much, Josh.